Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at MVC controllers and injecting our own voting poll factory service into the dependency injection container and bringing that up in our controller and interacting with the data through Postman. In today's episode, we're going to briefly touch on views, but then primarily we're going to go into Razor pages. And I'm going to explain the difference between the two. So let's go ahead and start. First thing that we'll need to do is add a service. So how we add controllers here, what we have to do is add controllers with views, okay? And what this allows us now to do is to use another set of services that will essentially say, right, this data that we would usually return from the controller to Postman as JSON, we now want to template it into HTML. But specifically, we're going to be using CS HTML files. And these stand for C# HTML, right? So in these files, C# is used as the templating language. So same as with controllers, we will need a views folder. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a views folder. And in here, we have to follow a convention for to what controller do these views belong to. Okay, so here we will have to type in home folder for our home controller. And let's go ahead and create an index page. And I'll have to add the CS HTML type of file to it. Okay, so here's the file, and here we have index. Quickly, let's go ahead and just say h1 tab to create a tag for a header, and we'll just say that this is an index page. To display this page, we will have to create an action, same as we return any data. Just remember that we are going to be returning data here as well. Here we return a string in JSON format. Here we're going to return a string in HTML format. It's up to the client that's going to be receiving that data to interpret it and display it, okay? But all we're doing is returning data in string format that is then represented by either HTML, JSON, and other types of formats, okay? If it's a file, it might be video-mp4 or whatever. So let's go ahead and create an HTTP GET. Here we'll do public iActionResult. And we'll create an index. So iActionResult is just an interface that certain return types, certain functions return, okay? And we can return a string here, and this is just like a generic return type, right? So what we can return here is a view, okay? And this will essentially try to find our index CS_HTML in the views folder. So here we'll look for views, home, index page, depending on the name of the action. So even if we change the name of the route, it will still return the page with the name index. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. And here we'll see first a 404 error, and that's because we opted in for the convention of having the controller name first. So let's go ahead and say /home here, and we should arrive at the index page. Now, we don't necessarily need to have this named as index. We can still target the index file. So let's go ahead and create another action here, and we'll call it about, just as a simple example. But what we will do is we will return an index page here, okay? So all we have to do, if we press F12 on the view, you will see that it's part of the controller class, okay, from which our home controller is inheriting. So you are opting in to this function to return a view, and I'm looking at the wrong class here. So view. And you will see that the first parameter is view name, and the second one is object model. We will get to that in a second. So here essentially we're specifying the view name, which is the index.CS_HTML here. So let's go ahead and run this. Let's go ahead and say home, and here you will see we'll run into a problem because of the REST API convention. And this is why I'm going to be teaching primarily Razor pages, because controllers should be primarily used for RESTful APIs that you're going to build. If you're going to be displaying HTML and stuff like that, you should be using Razor pages. But this is essentially how you fix it. What it's doing right now is it's saying, right, we have the base controller and we're going to try to find a get action at the root of it. So both of these stand at the root. So what we can do is at the top here as well, we can specify that the convention should be controller/action. Let's go ahead and run this. So here now, if we go to home, we won't see anything because now we have to specify the index page. Okay, so we're in the index page, and if we specify about, we're still on the index page, right? So you can see how the same action can return the same view as well. It just depends on the name that you set of the view. If you don't set it, where you're going to end up is this view is going to try to look for an about page, and it's not there, so it won't be able to return it. Now, adding this action, what this means for our create action here is that we will no longer be able to just post to /home. We'll have to post to /home/create, and we'll have to include the action name. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this about action because I just quickly want to cover a topic of passing models into here and the errors that you can run into. So what I'll do is I'll just create a class and I'll just call this info, right? It's just a temporary class that I'm going to create, delete in a second. It's just to show you how to pass information into your view, right, as a model. So we have a string and I'll just call this message. We will go ahead and create a new class, so var info equals new info, and we'll set the message. We'll say hello, and we're just going to go ahead and pass this in here. Now, again, bringing you into the types of functions that we have here, we're currently selecting this one. If you want to specify the view name and the object model that you're sending, you would be selecting this. Just know that if you are, for example, just passing in a string, so if you would pass in like some message here, it would try to look for a view here. So make sure that first, if you're passing a string here, and then you're passing in the data here. Okay, so let's go ahead and replace this with the information object. So we're going to be passing this into the view, and just how we would pass it into a function. So let's say we have a function. We would put in the type that we're expecting to get in the function in the parentheses. For the view, we have to specify at model. Okay, so at model, if I bring your attention to the view here, you will see that the object that we're passing is named model. Okay, so this is how you can understand this tag. This is the model, the object model that we're going to be passing into the view. Okay, and then we'll be able to use the information that we passed in there. And then what I want to specify then is the type. So I have to navigate to that type at the moment. So I will have to select voting system, UI, and I would have to go into controllers and info, because here I have my namespace, and in this namespace I defined this class info. So let me close these tabs real quick, and here I defined my model of info, and this here I'm just defining the type for my model, and now I can do an at and access the model class, and this is the function parameter. This would be the same as using the info here, just like this. We would grab the message, and here we would do the same. We would say model message, and this is the same. Make sure you put an @ sign to access C# code, otherwise this is just a string at this point. This isn't code. So if you want to grab a single variable, you would do this. If you want to surface it in a scope, so a code scope, we would do this. Okay, so notice how if I bring this out of scope, it just turns into a plain string. Okay, so here's how we create C# code scope, and make sure you understand that just like normal C# scopes of code, it executes from top down. Okay, and this is just a templating language. So let's go ahead and remove this. We'll create a second header, and all I want to do is just pass in my message here. Alright, and for the message, let me delete this function because I no longer need it. It's just going to be hello. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Now we can go ahead into home/index, and here we'll see our message. Okay, and really simple, there's not too much here. We define an object, and in our view we define what kind of an object we want to pass, and then we can access that object through @model. So let's take a look at some of the errors that we can run into. Let's say we won't pass anything, right? Let's rerun this. And this is a common error that you will see when you're starting out. Basically, object reference not set to an instance of an object is basically a null reference, right? It's the same as if we would pass a null into that enfen function. Okay, so another error that you can get is, let's say we will grab the index, or rather let's pass a number, right? So we hover over it, and we still use the object model overload, right? So now we're going to pass a wrong type to the view, and we're expecting an info class, and what we're getting is a number. So let's see what we get. Okay, so we're going to go to home/index, and you will see we're going to get a different error, invalid operation exception. The model item passed into view data dictionary is of type system int32. So this is where we're passing an integer, but the view data dictionary instance requires a model of type info, right? So this is where it's saying, right, the view is expecting this type, but you're passing me an integer. And again, this is a very common error that you can run into. So this is pretty much the basics of views and passing stuff into them, and how to basically debug some errors that you have and some of the errors that you can run into, right? As I said, we're not going to be using views for this because I think controllers primarily should be used for API access, because I think controllers should be used for building RESTful APIs, and Razor pages should be used for building HTML pages. And I will leave this here for now, and we will use this to compare it to the Razor Pages implementation. To use Razor Pages, you would probably guess we need some kind of service, right? Because .NET Core is so modular, you need to opt in into certain stuff that you're going to be using, right? So in our services, what we're going to do is we're going to add Razor Pages here, okay? So let's save that, and what we'll have to do is press Ctrl-Alt-L, and instead of views, we will have to create a pages folder, and this is where the pages go into, right? So let's create a pages folder, and from here on, what I'm going to be using is Ctrl-Shift-A to create new files, because Razor pages are slightly different. And if you want to add a Razor page, you can right-click Add. Don't choose this option because it can be a little bit confusing in the creation window. Just add a new item, right? And the keybind is Ctrl-Shift-A. And what you want to choose here is a Razor page. So we're going to opt in for index.cshtml as our base page. And you will see a couple of things. So you will see the add page tag. So this is just a way to define that this is a Razor page. And this is where we would define stuff like these route conventions. We would define them right here, okay? We'll get to that in a second. Other few things that we're going to have with our Razor page is, if you take a look at your pages folder, you will have your index.cshtml, but you can press the right key or expand it, and you will find the index.cshtml.cs class. And let's open up this file as well. So we will see an index model, and this is pretty much the same as having a home controller, but for this specific page. And instead of the controller, we're inheriting from page model. All this on getBit is going to do is going to automatically return this page. So let's go ahead and say Razor index page here, okay? And what you can do instead of, if this is confusing to you, what you can do instead is you can use iActionResult, and you can return the page here. Same as with the view, you can either, if you don't specify a name, it will try to return the default page here. However, we don't get the option to return a different page, right? There is no such overload. What you would have to do is you would have to say return, redirect to page, and you would redirect to a certain other page and go through their controllers, right? So let's go ahead, and I will stick with the default notation of void and let it automatically return me the page. Let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So we are on the root page, but we don't see our index page. And if we go to /index, we still don't see our index page. Right? What's up? How do we get to the index page? Now you might wanna pause the video here and try to figure out yourself. Try to have a think about it. But if not, continue watching. So what is happening here? If you remember to how our information gets resolved in the first place, if you remember that this stuff, these actions, get resolved through the middleware, right? So instead of mapping out every individual block in the middleware, in our startup right here, instead of mapping out each individual block and making it return something, we opt into the controllers, into the MVC pattern, to have a controller and return some data, either raw JSON or HTML. Now, to be able to return information through the Razor Pages format, right? So it's even more fine-grained. Instead of having code blocks here, we went to controllers. So we would have a controller file, and each individual action would return something. Now what we're doing is saying, right, instead of having one file and having a bunch of pages in there, we're going to have an individual block of pages with the sort of controller on the back end with having the similar naming convention, okay? And this is a more modular design. So in Home Controller, all the pages and actions are under one roof of category, and in Pages, it's a category of that page. So each page has its own roof, okay? So what we have to do to actually be able to access our Razor pages, we have to tell our middleware how to find it, right? So this code block, we either get it from a controller, or now we want to say either get it from a controller or a Razor page. So let's go to our endpoints here, and let's type in Razor, and we will find the option or the function to map Razor pages. So now let's run this again. And now you see that once we hit the root URL here, we're gonna end up at a Razor index page. Now let's go ahead and see what happens if we can still access our home/index, and we can. However, we get this error here. That is the previous error with the integer. So let's go ahead and quickly resolve that, and let's have a little bit of a play around. So we're gonna put the info here, right? So we're passing the info to our view, which expects that specific model. If I open the index page here, sorry if it gets a little bit confusing with the pages. We're passing the info model to the index page of the view, okay? And this page lives on the /home/index route. Okay, the way the routing works with Razor pages is through the folder structure. So what we'll have to do here, or rather what I want to do here, is I want to add a home folder, okay, and I want to put the index page in the home folder. Okay, so let's go ahead and move that. So now essentially what we're doing is we have the same routing convention both in the home controller and for our Razor pages. So let's go ahead and see what gets returned, right? So here we are on the root page. Let's go to home/index. We'll get the controller page, right? But if we go to /home, we're going to get the Razor page. So what exactly happened there? And to really understand what's going on there is to understand that the index page is the default convention for this is the default page, right? The index is the default page. There is no reason to say index because that's the default, okay? So when we go to /home, the default page for /home is index. So if we put another page here, just gonna grab a about page. I'm gonna put it in here, and what I will do is I'll just say h1 about. I'm gonna run this. So if I go to /home/about, I'm gonna get the about page, the Razor about page, and the index page is still there. So to be able to override the /home/index route, we would have to introduce the index folder here. And let's put our index page in there. So that's going to be the default page for the /home/index route. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Let's go ahead and grab our home/index. So here we're going to still end up with the controller. So if we go to index/index page, we're going to hit the Razor page. So you can see how this page is sort of going to break its own convention around the controller. So when you have controllers and Razor pages at the same time, they're sort of going to dance around. So this is where you are going to enter this sort of balancing act, okay? And you usually don't want to overlap these routes. But here what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all these silly folders. I'm going to drop the index page here. I'm going to delete the home folder. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into Razor pages and how they work, right? So let me actually get rid of all these tabs here, and I will drop down this views folder since we don't really need it anymore. I'm going to go into home controller. I'm going to clean up the index model here. I'm going to delete the info class here as well. Okay, so let's go ahead back into our index.cs.html. Let's open up these two. And let's take a look at the at page here and at the model. As I explained before, this is how we do our route conventions. So when you've seen me pass parameters through the route, let's go ahead and do the same. Let's do something simple like int id here. And we're just going to create a prop with int and we'll call it id and we'll set it. Okay, just like that. So we have access to this whole model. Instead of specifying a specific thing how we did in the controller and passed it as a function parameter, here the page is contained within the model. So this model right here, if we press F12, it's going to lead us to this cshtml.cs. So this is kind of the definition for this page. And the page lives in this module kind of thing. So when we're going to go to, let's create a second paragraph, at model, what we're really accessing is this whole class here. We don't really want the onGet function. What we do want is the ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and let's see how we can pass the ID to this page. So at the moment, the ID here is null. Let's go ahead and use a simple query string. So I'm going to put a question mark ID and I'm going to say 1. I'm going to see that it is quite smart enough to figure out that I'm passing this parameter in the query and it's going to bind it automatically. What if I want to pass it as part of the route? Well, I'm going to get a 404. So how do I want to access the index page and match this route, right? So what I want to do here is I want to open my quotes, and same as before, I just want to supply the ID here. Now what we're going to need is to rerun this, so I'm going to press Ctrl-Shift-F5. And now the original page is going to be 404 because we can no longer match the route where we expect to have an ID at the slash, right? So now we can consider it as part of the parameter, and let's see if we still get our query string, and we don't, because we don't match the original route param. So you can see I'm passing ID s2 as a query string, but we're actually expecting it to be as part of the route definition, right? So to define a optional parameter in your route, you put a question mark after it, right? Make sure it's inside the curly brackets. Let's go ahead and run this. So now you can see we're still hitting the index page. If we now go to /1, we get the 1 here. And if we try to pass in a query string like ID equals 2, we can still get it from the query string, right? So it's kind of the best of both worlds here if you specify a optional one here. So let's go ahead and add some functionality to this. What we're going to do is we're going to grab stuff from our home controller, specifically this voting poll factory. We will put it into our index page. And I haven't talked about this yet, but let's actually, what we're going to do, as I've said in the previous episode, if you were listening, we can use the from service tag, from services, and this is dependency injection, but for your functions, actions, or handles. In the controller, this is called an action, and in a Razor page, this is called a handler. So what we're going to do is inject the service instead of the constructor. We're going to inject it straight into the handler. And the places that you want to do this is usually if the service is consumed only inside this handler, there is no reason to create a constructor, right? So let's go ahead and add a from services. We'll import using ASP.NET Core MVC, and we're going to grab our iVoting poll factory, and we'll put the voting poll factory in here. Okay. And now we don't need to make a constructor for it. I'll delete the ID right here. And we're not really going to be needing it here. However, we will just make sure that this works first and then move stuff about. So let's go ahead and grab the result from this function, poll factory. We'll create something, and whatever it needs is to pass a voting poll factory request. So let's create a request, voting poll factory request. We're going to create a new one of these, and let's go ahead and say that the title is title, description is desk, and names are, let's say 1, 2, and I think that will be enough. Forget the closing thing here, and new array, will it find it? Oh, I don't need the on the end there, and put the request here. So we got the result here, and it is of type voting poll. What we can do is let's go ahead and create a prop of voting poll. We'll need to do an import here from models. Oh, not that. Not voting poll, but voting poll. We're not gangsters. We are programmers. Right, so let's go ahead and name this poll. And what we're going to do is we're just going to assign to this poll here. And now we're going to just display this information here. So instead of our model.id, we deleted the ID property. We now have access to the poll, and we're going to grab the title, display the title, and let me copy this a couple of times. I'm going to display the description here, and we still have access to all the C# goodies like the for each loops, while loops, everything. And we can do this to template this out. So let's go ahead and create a for each loop. We'll say var counter in model pol counters. Counters, and for each one of these we can display a paragraph where we can grab the counter. We can display the count, we can display the name. Let's start with the name and dash at counter dot count. Yeah, this will be alright. And just remember about the code scopes. If you have a couple of things that you want to define before or after, so you can do this here. If you need like a variable here, you can define this here. If you need an integer to like do the counts, you can define this integer here, and you can still set it here. Okay, so the state here is global pretty much, unless you do something like add another scope right here. Okay, so now this A no longer exists here because A only exists in this scope here. So generally scope rules still work here. Just find your footing, play around, and get your own understanding of this. Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and change this back for each. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and display this, make sure this works. Okay, and you see that our factory still works. It will create the voting poll with the counter names that we have provided. How about we do it through a form, right? So we actually want to capture some data. So when we display this information, what we want to do is we want to capture the parameters that are needed for this request, and not the home controller, but it's still the same parameters, right? We want the voting poll factory.request. So what we can do is let's go ahead and copy this poll. We'll grab the request, put it here, and we'll call it request. Not request, but request. So now there is this parameter, and what we're going to do with the form is we're going to post it. Okay, so what we're going to do is create a public vote on post, and we don't need to supply any parameters. The request should still be there. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and copy this poll here, and we're going to supply this request. And the poll factory should really be residing in this function now. And for this, we're just going to comment this out. And what we're going to do is put a breakpoint on line 25. Okay, and we're just going to create a simple form. It's going to error, but we're just trying to understand Razor pages. Okay, we'll remove all of this stuff. We will go ahead and create a form. We don't need to specify an action. Okay, it will just post to this self. You don't need to specify anything here unless you want to post it to a controller or somewhere else. In this form now, we want to create an input field, and the name for it, we want to say request.title. So we're finding the navigational property to this request, and inside the request we have the title, right? So this is named request, and the property title is named title. So this is where we're going to try to fill out the title. Let's go ahead and remove this value, and we'll remove the type. I stopped messing it up. Okay, so real simple form. Let's go ahead and also create a button to submit it. So submit, and we're gonna call it type submit. Let me close this error. So simple form. Let's go ahead, check if we got the breakpoint. We got it. Let's go ahead and run this and try to submit this. Okay, let's go ahead and say title, press submit, and we're gonna run into a 400 error. Now, this error has occurred without us actually hitting the onPost function. And by the way, the get and post conventions are similar to the HTTP get and post tags in the controller. So the error occurred before we hit our handler. Why has that happened? It's a security measure that .NET Core provides for you with forms, and what you need is an anti-forgery token. So let's go ahead and stop this. And what we're going to do is we're going to add HTML anti-forgery token. Okay, just as simple as that. Now let's go ahead and run this again. And now what we're going to do is we're going to press F12. I'm going to disable the mobile screen. I'm going to hover over this form, and in here we're going to see one of the inputs that is generated with the name underscore underscore request verification token, blah, blah, blah. So this is what it basically generates for you with this @HTML anti-forgery token. Now you're not going to have to do this all the time, and we're going to cover that in a second, but let's go ahead and try to submit title, right? So we're going to submit it, and now we can hit the action. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the request, and it is going to be null. Now the reason for that is because we need to use a attribute called bind property. Right before, where we were passing it into the function as a parameter, it could bind it that way, but now we're adding it as bind property here, and that's how it's going to bind it instead of passing it here as a parameter. And there is another functionality that this unlocks that we're going to look at a second. So let's go ahead and run this. Again, I'm going to submit title, and now if we hover over the request, we're going to see an object with the title, right? So we are able to submit our information, and just as a kind of proof of concept, let's stop this. We will go into cshtml.cs. We will comment this bit out. I'm going to grab the type and the name. I'm going to pass it here in the function as a parameter. And let's run this. Okay, and again, let's submit title. And you can see that the object is not null as well, and the title is here. So this is pretty much opting into having it as a parameter here. You can do that, but with this, we're going to unlock an ability to shorthand our model binding to this form. Okay, so what I mean by that is, let's go ahead and get rid of this here. I'm going to uncomment this, and I'm going to rename the request to form because it is colliding with the request object that lives on the HTTP context. Okay, so you can either access it through HTTP context, or it is a global property here. Okay, so I don't want to collide there. I will take this form name and pass it here. So now if I want to submit it, I will have to change this to form. But you can get a bit of IntelliSense and remove this anti-forgery generation by using tag helpers. So what we're going to do here at the top, we're going to add tag helper, and we're going to select everything from Microsoft soft, and if I go in here for model, just to give me, or actually Microsoft, I can't remember it exactly, so I'll need a little bit of help. I will go into Microsoft, ASP.NET Core, MVC, and tag helpers. So I want to grab this namespace and I want to put it here, and this is where tag helpers live. So what are tag helpers? Tag helpers essentially allow you to have a little bit of IntelliSense and custom form generation based on different things. So for example, we now have access to ASP dash, and this is called a tag helper, which is essentially an attribute on your form, which is then converted to some HTML attribute, right? So we can point this form to an action or a page handler, etc., right? So what we do with this binding here is we would say ASP4, right? And what we do here is we grab the property that we have set bind property. We're just going to type in form, and select the title, all right? And this is going to generate some HTML for us. Now let's go ahead and also comment out this anti-forgery token generation, and let's run this. Right, so now if we press F12 for developer tools and take a look at the form again, and by the way, to select the element, I'm pressing this arrow with a little on the square to then select whatever element. You can also press Ctrl-Shift-C and select something as well, right? So we're in the form, and I'm going to expand this, and you can see that the verification token is added on automatically, and the input field has the name form.title added automatically, and the ID as well, and the type text, right? So this ASP-4 essentially is Razor syntax, and it's a tag helper to essentially then translate this attribute into this form, okay, for this specific field. All right, so when we then go and submit this title, we can still grab it on this form here, right? So title. So let's go ahead and fill out the rest of the information, like description and the names. So description is going to be self-explanatory. I'm going to delete this anti-forgery thing. We're going to grab the description, and then similar, if you have again paid attention in the previous video, the way we do this for the names, because it's an array, we will need to provide inputs here, and usually this would be handled through JavaScript, but for now, I'm just going to submit 3 fields, right? Because this tutorial is not about building a nice functional UI. This is about being able to develop your modules and then hook them up to your UI. Same as if you are starting off programming, you're going to have a single program in your single file, and you might spread it into different classes, and then you want to hook it up to a web application. This is more about that than building a nice UI, right? So I'm just going to opt in for the 3 options here, and let's go ahead and run this. So I'm going to say title, this is description, this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. Yeah, let's say 3. We'll submit this, and we're going to go into the form right here. We're going to see our 3 strings there, the title, the description, and the rest of this, right? So let's go ahead and continue, and we have no errors thrown. However, we're still on this form. So we can also display the poll that we have created. So wherever this form was before, let me Control Z all the way back into the past, if it will allow me. There we are. A little bit further. Don't want to mess this up. There we go. Let's copy that, and let's go all the way back to the future. Right, time traveling, advanced stuff. And we'll put it back down here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an if statement. So if model dot poll doesn't equal null. So if we have a poll to display, we're going to display this, right? So we're wrapping this in a if statement. Okay, so one more thing is we don't need an at here, because this is sort of not losing the C# scope. So if you will see, we're starting the C# scope at the at, and inside these brackets, if I can format this a little bit like that, inside here we have the C# scope. So C# scope. So once we enter the HTML tag, we exit the C# scope, and we need to use the at tag again. Here we're not inside the HTML scope. If we would have put an HTML tag here like this, we would then need to use the at sign, but we're not. But again, this is the Razor page syntax. You will get used to it the more you use it, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Just know that this is a way that you can represent your information. So let's go ahead and rerun this, Control-Shift F5. Alright, so again, let's go title, description, and fill this form out real quickly. Alright, so there we are. Again, this is void. We do not have a iAction result where we return the page, where you can do the redirects and stuff like that. We're just going to return to the same page. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue here. And you can see our poll is being displayed here because we have now assigned it to this property here, and the whole index model is available through the model that is bound here. So hopefully this makes sense. Again, this is just an introductory to the Razor pages. We're not actually building out any fancy UI here. In the episodes to come, that's what we're going to start doing. So stay tuned. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comment section. Don't forget to join the Discord server. And as always, see you in the next episode.